Money and power, they're natural bedfellows, of course, but when you hear that the Australian government right now has a net debt of $516 billion, or that the US had a debt ceiling of $31.4 trillion US, or even that Elon Musk is worth $219 billion, or that Google's owner Alphabet is worth $1.57 trillion US, your eyes kind of glaze over. Where does the money come from? How is it created? That's been occupying the mind of Paul Sheard, Australian-American economist who's the former research fellow and senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. He was also the global chief economist at Standard & Poor's. Now he's writing a book called The Power of Money. More than that, you can see how governments and banks create money and help us all prosper. And he joins me now from our Melbourne studio. Paul, great to have you on the program. Righto, so a lot of people are going to sit there and say there's so many zeros on so much of this money. It almost seems like it's out of all proportion with an ordinary person's life. Is that the way it should be viewed?
I don't think so, Ross. There's really two sides to a balance sheet, and I think you need to look at the amount of money or the amount of debt, and I do in this book look at government debt, which people wring their hands about, as really being a form of money. It's purchasing power that you can transfer into the future. But you need to look at those numbers with all those zeros in relation to the size of the economy. So you mentioned, for example, the US overall government debt is $31.4 trillion. Actually, that's not quite that bad. If you net out debt that's held within the government, different parts of the government owning other debt in other parts of the government, it's more like perhaps comes down to eventually down to around about 19 trillion, particularly if you take into account the debt that the Federal Reserve is holding. So it's not as bad. But the US economy is about a $26 trillion economy. So, perhaps if you wanted to think about it in household terms, which is not always a good idea, think of those numbers relative to your income. So if you had, for example, $31,000 debt and you had $26,000 income, you probably wouldn't be as worried as if you just focused on the 31,000 number.
But when economies falter and when governments stimulate significantly, is that really bringing forward some future earnings, as it were? Does that make the future generations less wealthy as a result of bringing forward that money by borrowing for today's crises?
I don't think so. I don't think, again, that's the right way to think about it, Ross. And again, in my book, I kind of try to dispel some of the misconceptions. The job of the government and the central bank, the RBA in Australia, obviously, is really to make sure, when it comes to macroeconomic policy, that the economy is operating at full employment, at its capacity, and not causing inflation to go above, the limit of, or the target of 2 to 3%. So, when we have these crises, we had one with the famous GFC, we had another one with COVID more recently, obviously. It would be the wrong approach to look at the economy and see, the bottom of the economy falling out, but then for fiscal authorities and monetary authorities to hold back on pumping their ammunition into the economy because they're worried about the future. Now, you can end up with too much government debt accumulating if that debt as purchasing power starts to cause inflation. But, that's a bridge to a large extent that you can cross when you come to it. And, of course, in this country and in the Northern Hemisphere, we did get to that bridge a year or so ago.
OK, and then what you've got is the response from the central banks to raise interest rates, as we've seen, to make the price of money more expensive, to try and, if you like, limit demand in an economy. The question is, do you think it's working right now?
Well, central banks all around the world, not just the RBA, have really got an uphill battle. And, the starting point, of course, was the COVID kind of induced recession. Activity was obviously restrained dramatically. And then you had all the monetary and fiscal policy injected into the economy. And then we had a very strong recovery. But what we found coming into that recovery was supply had been damaged by the COVID lockdowns, particularly, I think, in the US, where the numbers are even worse than in Australia in terms of lost labour supply. But demand came back quite strongly and robustly, and we had this huge inflation shock. And that was a real error on the part of the monetary and fiscal authorities. Maybe they had good reasons for making that forecasting error, but now they have to catch up and bring inflation down. And the way to do that is either with hiking interest rates or raising taxes and cutting expenditure. any of those options is very painful, because the only way to bring inflation down in these kind of circumstances is either to increase supply, but that's a very slow-moving process. Certainly the central bank can't control that. And the other one, of course, is to restrain demand. And that's what the higher interest rates are aimed at doing. Unfortunately, it's painful economically, and it can turn out to be painful politically for governments as well.
You argue in your book that there needs to be better coordination between monetary and fiscal policy. And yet, is that possible when you have independent central banks that act quite differently sometimes as compared with the way in which governments act and perform in their own budgetary priorities?
Yes, I think it is possible, Ross. I mean, it's a nuanced discussion. It's not easy. But the reason that we have independent central banks all around the world now, including the RBA, is because governments can create money, print money at will, and of course, if left to their own devices. And if driven by political influences, we will get inflation and hyperinflation, and everybody's going to suffer. So the great kind of innovation in monetary affairs of the 20th century was to create this independent, technocratic central bank within the government. The problem is that monetary policy, often is called a blunt instrument. It is not a cure-all for all of the policy ills in the economy. And in particular, when it comes to managing aggregate demand, fiscal policy is very important. So I think there should be ways to preserve the independence of the central banks, the ability to take away the punch bowl when the party gets started, if necessary, and at the same time have a good coordinating framework with the government's fiscal policy. The good news, Ross, in this country is that the framework here is actually quite conducive to that. It's already built into the framework. Now, we're going to see some changes coming over the next year or two with the nature of that relationship, and I think that's an important debate to have. But Australia, Japan Japan's another economy that actually have a pretty good framework for coordinating monetary and fiscal policy. I don't think we should be worried about that. We should try to actually improve it.
So in the introduction, I did mention the big numbers that say Alphabet is worth, or that Elon Musk worth $219 billion US dollars. Is it the job of government, therefore, to try and distribute that wealth more evenly through the economy, or is it to allow people, through their own endeavours, to create this enormous amounts of wealth and really, if you like, to create an entrepreneurial spirit inside the economy?
Yes, I have a chapter in my book, Ross, which is the power of money to create wealth, but also inequality. So I think, as your question indicated, wealth creation and inequality being generated often go hand in hand. If you look at these, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, these people have unbelievable sort of wealth, but a lot of it is paper wealth. It really comes from the stock value, the market capitalization of the companies that they founded. And that wealth is actually being generated by millions, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions, even billions of satisfied customers. So I think inequality is an important issue, but I think it probably is better approached from the back end rather than the front end. We don't want to restrain entrepreneurial activity, and often extreme wealth levels are signs of the success of entrepreneurs, essentially generating goods and services that consumers want. But perhaps we need to think of different ways of approaching that problem, the people left behind. And that's really, I think, a much more important role for fiscal policy. But when it comes to that, the central bank needs to keep an eye on it as well. It gets back to that coordination issue, because if you try to redistribute wealth and give more wealth to the lower income folks, which is a very good thing to do in many ways, that will also stimulate aggregate demand, and you've got to take away that demand somewhere else in the economy. One of the problems is taxing the wealthy, the super wealthy. They don't really utilize or use enough resources to make much of a difference at a very macro level.
I'll tell you what, it is good to have a conversation with you, Paul Sheard. People should look out for that book, The Power of Money, but we appreciate your time here on the program today.
Pleasure, Ross. Thanks very much.